Good morning, Tiffany. How are you?
Hi, Tony. I am good. How are you? Deep
Excellent.
breath. It's a good start to our video here. Deep
Right.
breath.
Yes. Deep breath in. The cool thing is we're actually talking about fear today. I think it's an important subject to talk about today for our teens and youth because of the current climate and the current situation. There's a lot of fear going around this whole COVID-19 situation, and I think it really is affecting our youth. And one of the things that really kicked me into wanting to talk about that with you this morning was just last week. We were at home. My two daughters, they're going through this emergency distance learning. My oldest one was sitting in her bedroom, and I just went up to check on her, and there was a lot of tension in the room, and I was just like, "So what's going on?" She wasn't getting on with the subject. She wasn't getting on with the work. So immediate dad fail, right? I jumped in to try and push her and try and work her harder. That didn't work, and suddenly there was a breakdown, and there was lots of tears and lots of emotions coming up. And I sat there and said, "Okay, take a step back. What's going on?" And through her tears, she just said, "I'm afraid." And I was like, "Oh wow, I didn't expect that. What are you afraid of?" And she's just finishing up elementary and going into middle school. And she said, "I'm going into middle school this year, and I am afraid that I won't know enough to step into middle school." And in that moment, that fear was very real, and it was to her crippling. And so all I could do was right then, just give her a big hug and just hold her and just allow her to feel that sense of fear. So, Tiffany, what is it? What is fear? Tell me more. Tell us more about it. What's going on?
So, fear is a natural response that our body is basically alerting us that something isn't right. So, fear is a belief that someone or something in our lives is dangerous, something that's going to hurt us, something that might cause us pain, or is a real threat that we need to protect ourselves from. And as you mentioned earlier, fear can be crippling. The word that I like to use is paralyzing, and that all just really describes this way that fear kind of stops us in our tracks many times and prevents us from moving on. So there's this basic response that our bodies go into when our brains are transmitting the message to our body that something is dangerous, something's happening. So the fear response is, there's three basic responses usually: fight, flight, or freeze. So fight is, oh, someone's attacking me, I'm gonna fight back. That's an example. Freeze is like the deer in the headlights, and it's paralyzing, it's crippling, you can't move, you can't respond, nothing's happening. And flight is avoidance, running away. And those are all good things when you think about some real threats or dangers that we have in our lives. I think what can be the struggle is when we try to emotionally suppress the fear and avoid the fear. And in that story, I love that story that you shared. It just shows this way that, yeah, maybe your first reaction to your daughter's fear maybe wasn't exactly what she needed. And then you soon realize, like, oh, well, my initial response to what's happening with my daughter right now isn't actually working. And you then turn to compassion. And I think that's really the important key of this is us learning, myself included. I feel like I'm reminding myself of these things constantly, is the response that I need to have towards myself and others in my life when fear is involved isn't to be a bully. It isn't to, oh, we'll just get over it, or your fear doesn't matter, just keep going. It's actually what we need in those moments is compassion. We need to really just sit with those feelings, ask ourselves what's going on. A lot of times the fear is activating and rubbing up against some deeper rooted
Mm-hmm.
wounds that we have, whether
Mm.
that's from childhood or an actual event that had happened in the past. Fear is real and it's valid. And it's usually kind of like a flag of like, hey, what's going on here? Like usually it's something else going on than just the surface level thing. Just like in your story, your daughter was upset about her schoolwork. Well, it wasn't just about the schoolwork, right? It was really about this
Yeah.
deeper rooted emotional experience that she was having about, well, oh, the repercussions of what's happening now, and her school looking differently than it had ever looked for her before, and these fears that she's not going to be prepared for middle school. And that's a complicated fear, because it's not
Mm-hmm.
just about what's going on right now with the coronavirus and the fear there, and her life changing, and that's big and valid in of itself. There's this deeper rooted, oh, she's already been mentally and emotionally thinking about the fact that next year she takes this big leap from elementary school
Mm-hmm.
to middle school. And so that's a really great picture of, almost always our fears are more complicated than maybe the surface level reaction seems. And so I love how you were able to sort of pivot your response and realize
Thank you.
that the loving, compassionate response is actually what she needed. Um, so
And
yeah, I
and
think,
you bring some
oh, go
good
ahead.
points up there. Yeah, no, I was just going to say you bring some good points up there, because fear is a natural human emotion, and we need it, right?
Yeah, a lot is going on. And I think the important part of kind of those next steps is realizing, okay, what's happening right now? I'm experiencing fear. So it's pausing and acknowledging what's happening mentally, emotionally, physically in your body. And then it's accepting and acknowledging the fact that, okay, this is fear, if it's fear, and validating it and recognizing that, okay, this, whatever this fear is, whatever's triggering this fear, it's really real to me in this moment, whether it's a perceived fear or a realistic fear that's actually happening, because there can be both. There can be a perceived fear that's not actually reality, and then sometimes fear is based in reality, and that's really a scary thing that I need to get away from, or whatever the thing is, whether it's an emotional fear or a physical fear. And so I think the next step of that is digging a little deeper, like, okay, the surface level reaction is fear. So now let's figure out, like you said, what is going on in the gap, what's going on inside of us. So the fear, like I mentioned earlier, is oftentimes activating and rubbing up against these deeper rooted wounds. And also fear is more of a surface level emotion. So what wounds is it rubbing up against that maybe are, like you had mentioned, blowing this fear out of proportion to an
Mm-hmm.
unrealistic place? Or what are the other emotions that the fear is stirring up? Maybe the fear is stirring up anxiety, sadness, uncertainty. There's so many emotions that the fear can be activating and triggering. And then I think the next step to that is assessing whether the fear is based on truth. So maybe it's based on evidence of a previous experience. Like, oh, this has happened to me before, and I've experienced the same fear before. So I need to learn from the past and do this certain reaction that either worked for me in the past, or do a different reaction that didn't work for me in the past. So
Like,
it's basically assessing whether it's truth based in reality or not.
mm-hmm.
And sometimes it's figuring out that, oh, the fear that I'm having, yes, there's some grain of truth to this. Yes, my fear is valid, but really the amplification of it, the bigness of my experience or my reaction really isn't rational.
Mm-hmm.
So it's growing into these places of emotional maturity and mental maturity where we can, and oftentimes with the help of others, whether it's a mentor, a friend, a counselor, is being able to go through that process and assess whether it's rational or irrational, either our response or the fear itself, and sometimes both. And then I think the next place that's the healthy place to get to is sitting with our emotions, sitting with the mental state. It's really uncomfortable. It's not comfortable at all. And that's part of that maturity too, is being okay with not being okay. Sharing your fears with someone else. And this is where mentoring can be really beautiful and helpful. Sometimes we need to share these fears with someone who's not in our family. Like, yes, maybe our parents are really safe people, or maybe a sibling is a really safe person. I think as humans, though, we need people who are a little bit more third party. They're not maybe our closest friend, so maybe it's someone who's older, more knowledgeable than us. They're not a family member, but we can create this deeper emotional intimacy with someone that can kind of walk with us through the trenches, walk with us through our fear, help us acknowledge what's happening, help us validate what's happening, and help us work through it instead of avoiding it. Because sharing it with someone else, facing it ourselves, validating it for ourselves, and having other people's validate it for us really takes the power away from the fear. And so the goal here is to learn how to be okay with feeling and experiencing these uncomfortable things, feeling and experiencing the fear and all these deeper rooted things that it's triggering and uprooting, and then working through the fear past this fight, flight, freeze response to be able to respond from a healthier place. And I'll add a caveat to that. Sometimes we really do need to embrace the fight or flight response if it is a really dramatic, scary, physical event that we have no control over, and we really do need to flee the situation before we can pause and process the emotions. I would say that is something that would probably be categorized more as trauma, and our response would maybe be different. We're going to need more support surrounding that. The response is different for that. So I'll sort of set that aside from the bigger conversation that we're having here, but I wanted to note it because I don't want this conversation to invalidate that big T and little t traumas are real, and that can be maybe a conversation for another time. But that sort of response and aftercare is going to be a little bit different than some of the day-to-day fears that we're talking about here.
For sure. Yeah. And so really what I heard you say there, just to kind of summarize this, is fear is real. It's something that's out there. Our response to that fear is the important part. Yes, if it's big, traumatic, get out there, do what you need to do. But if it's something like my daughter was going through, this fear of going into middle school and not being prepared, it's now how we deal with that. If I focus my attention and thoughts on that fear, then I actually make the fear more real. And so it then becomes a bigger picture inside of me, right? And so the idea is to look at the fear and almost kind of acknowledge it as a person. Oh yeah, hello there, fear. I see you again. You're back. Right? Almost acknowledge it as that person to say, I see you, I understand you, you're there. Then, okay, what is it that's triggering that? Where's it coming from? Why am I feeling that? And question the origin and question the thinking. That I'm doing with my daughter is we actually sat there through and said, okay, so here's the circumstance. You're going to middle school. Now, what's the thinking of that, right? And we got her to think that going into middle school can be an exciting place to learn new stuff. So maybe it's a good place to be is not prepared, right? And so if we can create a thought that says it's going to be an exciting place to go learn, that emotion now, instead of it being fearful, that emotion can now turn to curiosity or excitement. And so then the action is, okay, I'm going to engage the best I can in the work in front of me and move through this. This is awesome stuff. I'm hoping at home, if you're watching this now with the teens and the youth, my challenge to you is just embrace the fact that emotions are real. They're here to stay. You're going to experience them for the rest of your life. What can you do to actually be better in tune with the emotions that are going on in your body? Where do they show up? how do they feel, and then what thoughts create those emotions. Become a master of your thinking, because it's your thinking that's going to trigger those emotions. So journal, talk to mentors, talk to someone about this. If you've got any questions, please reach out to us here at Pure Game. You can always email us here at info@thepuregame.org. Anything else, Tiff, from you before we close?
No, I think that's a really great start to this conversation.
Awesome. Tiffany, thank you again for your input, and I love what we're talking about. So looking forward to next week.
Yes, me too. Bye, Tony.
Cheers.
Bye, everyone.